Hegel wrote The Science of Logic because while philosophy had achieved a higher standpoint of self-awareness during Hegel's own lifetime, it had not understood the consequences of this higher standpoint for logic specifically. And so opens Cadell Last in the Anthology, Logic for the Global Brain, the third philosophy portal anthology, which is following on the class that Cadell Last hosted and led on Hegel's Science of Logic. It has been in the works for nearly 2 years, and it is wonderful to have it in the world. We're very happy about it. And what Hegel's philosophy completes in the Science of Logic, so writes Cadell Last, is the positivization of the rational antinomies that we find in Kant for the forward movement of historical process, not towards utopian community, but ever deepening contradiction. It is from this standpoint that we get Hegel's own mature political philosophy and the philosophy of right, which was also a classic. Cadell continues, the reason why philosophy portal works with Hegel as a foundation is because not only has academic philosophy lost contact with the truth of Hegel's logical insights, but our political world appears to be under the threat of a serious regression towards pre-modern forms of political organization and thinking, as opposed to the sublation of the obvious failures of liberal democracy. Following Hegel, Cadell would suggest that these two dimensions are linked. What is at stake in this regression is the collision with rational antinomies that are not only too complex for anyone to resolve, but also too intense for anyone to conceive as positive. Thus, we will be talking about the logic for the global brain, which does have political, social, economic ramifications. The sections are divided. Part 1, Stakes in the Underground. We have the concept of being by Cadell Last, from meditation to mediation, and back again by Layman Pascal, on Analysis Communitas by me, which is highly indebted to Anthony Morley's work on Leibniz, which I cannot suggest enough. And then Scenes versus Intellectual Milieus by David McCarricker, who is over at Theory Underground, and they do unbelievably good work over there. And then there's a fantastic intermission on the historic frequency theory, a conversation with Alex Ebert. And freak theory is a tremendous theory. I've had a few conversations with Alex about it. He's had some with Cadell, Tim Adlin. Highly suggest looking more into that. And the stakes in the underground is going to be very important for thinking this new community, this new political organization. Because if we can't think that, then all we're going to have is a state that's going to be top down, and it's not likely that we're going to be addressed as subjects in a different way. Cadell writes further in the opening piece, why not give into the metaphysical temptation of a universal general being stripped of any meaningful engagement with historicity and knowledge, where we can thoughtlessly commune independent of real ontological differences and antinomies? So that seems to be many political projects are sort of this unified, perfect structure of being, and why not seek that? Well, this leads to another question that Cadell asks. Where does Hegel start with the idea that logic is metaphysics? Because, if logic is metaphysics and we see in metaphysics some sort of essential contradiction, then logic would have to formulate accordingly. Well, Hegel starts with the idea that modern political consciousness had assumed that, with our higher self-aware standpoint, we could relegate metaphysics to a historical curiosity, thus separating logic and metaphysics, if you will. This belief was driven by Kant, perhaps most of all, whose maxim that the understanding ought not to soar above experience regulated metaphysical thinking to the category of discardable mental fancies. Thus, modern political consciousness thought that some combination of science and common sense could replace metaphysics. What this approach misses is that when we lose metaphysics, we actually lose spiritual life, and we mean spirit in the way that Hegel means it. And another way to look at it is if you throw out metaphysics, you can't address the religious layer in the phenomenology of spirit, which leads to all sorts of pathologies, psychoses, and massive problems that we're seeing on the political sphere, because what ends up happening is if you don't address the religious layer, people still seek it, and they seek it in very problematic ways. All desires for a religious spiritual life totalize the political question can be found in this precise lack. So if you lack the metaphysics, you end up getting these totalizing political projects. And then Cadell continues, in that philosophical political context, please consider this engagement with the science of logic as pointing towards forms of logical thinking that are not only a product of a spiritual life of the real, but also forms of logical thinking that can inform the real of future spiritual life. And so the next section of the anthology, which would be exploring some logics that are needed today to help us address these pathological political projects. Max Macken has given us an excellent piece called Do We Need Hegel's Presuppositionless Philosophy, which will be talking about Holgate's notion that in Hegel is a presuppositionless philosophy. Dimitri has given us Hegel's concept of true infinity. He has also given us the work of love, both of which I suggest. Quinn with The Living Contradiction, and Quinn is a fantastic scholar, as is Jason and James and Raza and Philip. We just have wonderful contributions in this anthology. I can't say enough about all of them, and the pieces bring out parts of Hegel and make them relevant to us today in very important ways. Forgetting the Forgetting by Jason, Nothing Matters by James Wisdom, Internal and External by Raza Ali, Est Ist So by Philip Shen, and then the next intermission to Singularities Between New Atheism and Spiritual Community, a conversation with Peter Robinson. And again, those are going to be talking about, a bit is going to be touching on the neoliberal project of basically atheism and common sense, or science and common sense. Not that atheism and science necessarily have to go together, but they've at least tended to in the last 30 or so years, certainly after 9/11. And why exactly that project has led to various failures that have then manifest on the political stage in very problematic ways. And I think the more we grasp that, the more we'll be able to understand how to move into the future. Again, the stakes are high, Cadell writes in his opening piece. For spirit to think its own essence means basically to remain committed to tearing with one's own contradictions and the forms of negativity that are implied by these contradictions. The resulting work of the patient concept should actually provide the subject of metaphysics that was not given a priori, but rather the result of one's life work. And this is very important. This is a metaphysics that is with substance as subject, as the line goes. And so the metaphysics is with the subject and indivisible from the subject, and has a lot to do with how the subject is toward the world, informed in relation to the world, primarily the negativities and real of the world. Cadell continues, we cannot get by on just science and common sense alone, but we also cannot regress back to pre-modern metaphysics as a given logic. In regressing back to pre-modern metaphysics, we fall into the well-known problems of particularist denominational conflict, as well as obfuscation of real essential problems of spirit that cannot be reduced to past concepts of static and fixed frameworks of being. I think that is spot on. I think that really gets at the issue. It's beautifully put. And Cadell writes, admittedly, Hegel's path for a science of logic is not an easy one. But part 3, which helps perhaps give us some guidance on how we might navigate this difficult path, but I do think it is the path we need to take. Part 3 is called For Speculative Futures. We have the Androgynous Organization by Timothy, Hegel and the Lateralized Brain by Matthew Stanley, The Science Fiction of Logic by Pavio, Hegelian Journeying by Carl Hayden Smith, Heidegger's Hegel by Thomas Wynne, and God's Thoughts by Cadell Last. All of those are tremendous scholars. Matthew has a wonderful book on silence that I suggest. Pavio is a tremendous writer in Thinking as Attention. Carl Hayden Smith on psychedelics and the hyperhumanism and extending the human versus replacing the human is tremendous. Timothy on the organization is very groundwork, very down to earth, very particular, very on the ground thinking about organizational formation, which is important. Thomas Wynne's work on Heidegger is tremendous, and the way he brings Hegel and Heidegger together is outstanding. And I really appreciate Cadell's closing piece on God's Thoughts. And arguably, to resume Cadell's piece, arguably one could suggest it is an impossible path, what is being suggested in this anthology. While Hegel lays out a philosophical science in his science of logic and not just a science of philosophy or a scientific philosophy, it is debatable whether or not the history of post-Hegelian philosophy has really remained committed to this gesture, or whether the history of post-Hegelian philosophy is a constant attempt to reinvent a weaker wheel. And there is a funny way where it would seem like that one of the greatest books, if not the greatest book of philosophy, The Science of Logic, was just completely ignored. I completely agree. And to resume Cadell, and while the path for a science of logic is not an easy one, its basic elements are surprisingly, in fact, stunningly simple. They involve the following. First, Logical seed of being nothing as a unity of true becoming. 2. Being nothing equals movements of being's immediacy, becoming's immediacy. And 3. Becoming equals logical mediation of being nothing. With this logical seed, the work unfolds. And Hegel opens with this logical seed. To resume Cadell, it is up to the real of spirit to recognize this immediacy and mediate its becoming. There is no external figure, no big other, which can do it for us individually or collectively. The ideal result would not be a return to a general universal being, nor a being of singularities without mediated connection, but rather a being of singular universalities that open historical spirit to deeper contradictions for thinking. That's the opening. That's how Cadell closes the opening note on the anthology. I highly suggest picking up a copy today. You can find it at Philosophy Portal. You can find it on Cadell's Amazon page. And for more, please visit Philosophy Portal. Please visit the YouTube page Cadell runs. Please check out the other anthologies on Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche and The Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel. And thank you so much for your time.